Good evening, everyone. John Henry Soto here. Welcome to JHS Interviews. Just want to quickly just say if anyone has enjoyed these interviews in the past, please hit the subscribe button and the like button and all those buttons that are there that will make me very, very happy. And today I am so excited. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to bring him on because I can't wait. This is Chuck Jacobs.
Hey folks, how you
Yay!
doing?
Thank you so much for being here, Chuck. I think we just had a brief conversation maybe about a year ago regarding some projects that you're working on, and one of them being a book that you're writing. And before we even go into any of the amazing career and all the Kenny Roger years and all that, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I have had this idea for a book for some years now, and actually before Kenny passed, we were still on the road in 2017. I sat in the dressing room with him one evening, and not often did we have one-on-one time, but it just happened that I was there with Kenny alone, and so I brought it up to him. I said, "Hey, Kenny, I'm working on a book of my experiences behind the scenes, and I think the fans might enjoy it." And he thought it was a great idea, and gave me his blessing, and thought that it would be a fun thing to have out there. So I started working on it, and then things got busy. I moved from Burbank to Clearwater, Florida in April of 2018. So we've been down here 2 years, and things got busy with other projects, etc. And I just put it on the shelf for a while. But now I'm back at it in earnest, and honestly, I hope to have it done in 3-4 months. And I'm going to probably more than likely self-publish it. There's publishers that have been interested, but in all truthfulness, I don't perceive it being a million seller, but I think it could sell well, and I think the profit margin is probably better if I just self-publish it. So that's what I'm going to be doing. It'll be available of course, on Amazon and directly, and then on when we do some touring with the Kenny Rogers Band, I'll have it in the merchandise table, etc., which we can talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. I mean, I think that the book will sell very, very well because I think the experiences and the stories that you have are unique to anyone else on the planet. You know what I mean? There's not many people that have the stories that you have, as well as to go along with the photo. I love that idea of the photo and then you telling a story. I think that that's a brilliant idea. So I think it will do really, really well.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, I've posted on Facebook. I've posted a story from time to time with a photo here or there, and the response has been modestly overwhelming. I mean, the people have said, "Oh my goodness, I can't wait to read the book. It's really great." And taking all the photos that I have, I've separated them up into decades. The 80s and the 90s, etc., and all the different places that we've gone and experiences, like riding on Kenny's plane. For instance, it was funny. I have some friends that are touring now and doing big time tours, and I don't take anything away from it at all. But they have posted, "Well, we're riding on a private, lease plane for this tour. It's really neat," and post some pictures. And I was sort of envious, because I'm not doing that right now. And then I thought back and I thought, wait a minute, we had a private plane for 16 years and we were on it every day.
Right.
And so I thought, well, I guess I'm not missing too much,
Right. Been
and
there, right?
some of the fun experiences of touring and unique situations of touring that I can go into as we progress through our interview here. But some of the ways that we toured were different than any other groups I've heard of. We toured around the year round. We didn't do just one tour and that was it. We would tour 100 all through the 80s, 78 through 92. We did probably anywhere from 150 to 200 shows a year, to 15,000 to 20,000 people a night for that whole time, all arenas. And in that whole time, that's 12 years there, Kenny had different planes. He had a DC-9 and another plane called a Bach 111 that was the size of a DC-9. Then he had a helicopter, and he had a Learjet. The one time when the bigger planes were down, he let the band take the Learjet, and he took one of the other smaller planes he had. That was a fun time. And but we would do one of the unique touring experiences. That Kenny had a large farm. Call it a farm. I don't know. Didn't do much farming, I don't think, but it was a beautiful 1,300-acre estate outside of Athens, Georgia, which is down by where the University of Georgia is. And I'll give you, for instance, let's say we played in St. Louis one night, and we'd play the show, and then we'd rush to get changed out of our show clothes into our street clothes, jump in the rental cars, and drive to the airport. And then we'd jump on Kenny's plane, and we'd fly from St. Louis to Athens, Georgia, to the small airport there, get off the plane into some vehicles that he would have there, and drive about 5-6 miles out to his farm, Beaver Dam Farms. And then we had a guest house that each of us had a separate bedroom for, so we had our own bedroom in this guest house. And then the next morning we'd get up and go fishing or horseback ridings or ride motorcycles or four-wheelers around the 1,300 acres. Just have fun. And about 6 o'clock, we would get back in the car and drive to the airport. And then let's say our next concert was in, let's say Wisconsin, let's say Milwaukee. So we'd fly to Milwaukee. We'd get there, and usually at that time we would have 2 opening acts. So we would get there in time to hear probably the second opening act, and we'd have dinner backstage and wait, get dressed and wait for our time to go on stage, go on and do the show. After the show, rush back and change our clothes and drive out to the plane and fly back to the farm and to our room at the guest house. So we would do that for like 2 weeks at a time.
Oh, wow.
And that's the way our tour would be. So we weren't in hotels. We'd have the same room every night. It was pretty unique.
So that touring schedule like that, I mean, that's got to be really rigorous. I mean, I don't think a lot of musicians did early on when you were, starting out and playing with different groups. Did you like the idea of being on those kinds of just endless touring and just being on the road all the time?
That's sort of a grueling schedule. You're right. I grew up in a real small town in northern Michigan, Bel Air, Michigan, about 300-400 people, very small. It was sort of like, I always say, the first 9 years of my life, I was like Opie Taylor out of Mayberry, because it was just like that, a real small town. And then we moved to the big city, which was Traverse City, Michigan. Now that was around 20,000 people. So
big city.
That's what I call the big city. And I lived there for about 8 or 9 years. And that's where I got my start in playing bass, and played with a group, a teen group, basically, called the Rainmakers in northern Michigan. And we toured all around Michigan and Ohio, Indiana, and had a couple 45s out that did pretty well in that time frame. We were in the same vintage as like Bob Seger when he first started out. In fact, we used to open up for Bob Seger from time to time. And then I always dreamt of going on the road. And so I was not quite 18, and I got a call from someone that I had met. Hey, this guy needs a bass player. Give him a call. I called this guy, and he'd never seen me. He'd only taken my recommendation from this other organist in Chicago, and he was a sax player out of Indiana. And we talked, and he said, "Well, I've got a job in where was it? New Haven, Connecticut. Where Yale is, I think." And he said, "Be there Monday." So I'd never even flown on an airplane at that point. And it was like October, I think, September, October. It was cold. And that one day I flew on a 2-engine prop from Traverse City to Grand Rapids. And then from Grand Rapids to Detroit, I flew on it was a Convair 580, but it's about the size of a DC-3. In other words, a tail dragger,
Mhm.
and but it was a pretty big plane. But it's, again, a large 2-engine prop. And then from Detroit to not O'Hare, but to LaGuardia on a 707. So in one day I flew,
3 planes.
never
Never
flown on a
flown
plane,
before.
and I
3.
flown all 3 places. Got to LaGuardia. Here I am with my Fender Bassman, the head, the amplifier, and a speaker, a suitcase, and my bass. And I had to get from LaGuardia to New Haven, Connecticut.
Oh my
This
god.
is 1968, and so at that time they didn't have like super shuttle or vans to take you here and there. They had, at that time, you've probably seen it in old movies, they would have a station wagon that had been enlarged, lengthened, and they would pack you in, and they'd have a luggage rack on the top. So here I put my amp and my speaker cabinet and suitcase on top, my bass inside, and off we went to New Haven. Got there, and I'd never met these people, understand. And I go to the front desk at this hotel, said, well, do you have a room for me, Jacobs? And they said, what is it? And I said, Chuck Jacobs. And the band leader's name was Donnie Sanders, sax player. They said, yep. And so sure enough, they had me. And that's where I started. And it was like a show group kind of thing, horns and rhythm section. And we would do dance music mostly, but somewhere in the evening, we'd do a show where we would take over the dance floor, and the horns would come out, and then the girl singer would come out and sing. You sort of get the picture.
Yeah.
And it was kind of funny. I had an afternoon rehearsal. I didn't know half the songs. And this is kind of a fun thing. The piano player, who became one of my closest friends, in fact, he was the best man at my wedding, was a Ray Charles lover. He just loved Ray Charles, and he sang a lot like Ray Charles, and he played piano. And so we did the first set, and I knew most of the songs in the first set, but not all of them. And he said, after the first set, we went back for intermission. He said, Chuck, do you know the Nashville number system? I said, well, I don't know that I do. I sort of know the number system because I'd taken some courses from Berklee School of Music, extension courses. And back many centuries ago, they used to have what they called the figured bass, where they would have a Roman numeral for 1 in the key of C, let's say, and then they would have a Roman numeral 4 for the F, which would be the 4th C, D, E, F, would be the 4th point, etc. And so the Nashville number system is sort of based on that. When they write out a chart for a national number system, you write out, if it's going C to F to G, it would be 1 to 4 to 5. And so he said, well, if you know how to do that, he says, what we'll do is you watch my left hand, and I'll go when we're in C, let's say, and I'll go like that. And then if the next chord is going to be an F, I'll just go like that. And if it's a 5, I'll go like that. If it's a 6, I'll go like that. And 2, etc. And that's how we got through the show. It was really funny. And I remember these guys were all older than me. I was like 17. These guys were in their mid-20s. And the bass player, or the drummer, was a really good drummer. Jerry Thompson was his name, I remember. And he was a pretty good drinker. Back in those days, drinking was bigger than drugs, but he was a pretty good drinker. By the end of the night, he'd be pretty looped. And I remember one night he said, Chuck, you're not bad. He said, you got pretty good time. If you didn't have a good time, I would have told Donnie to get rid of you right away.
Wow. Well, right to the point.
It was baptism by fire,
Right.
It was funny. But anyway, that was 1968 and 69 that same group developed and did a tour with the James Brown organization. with some notable black entertainers. Little Johnny Taylor was one of them, and Hank Ballard and the Midnighters. We did a tour all through the South, what they used to call the Chitlin Circuit, which was mainly all black clubs throughout the South. It was just a real eye opening for me. I'd grown up in a town in northern Michigan. I mean, we had zero blacks in our school. So I had the only experience I had with anybody of color was the migrants who would come in the summertime and pick the fruit, the cherries and peaches and apples and such, but not really any experience. So going through the South and seeing white only bathrooms and colored drinking fountains and the like was really a shock to me, and also traveling, all the headliners on the band were all black. So I got to know them real well, that was quite an experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. Did you have any idea, at that time what you wanted to do? Like what you
Well,
just wanted?
that's kind
Yeah.
of an interesting story, because growing up, my family was very musical. My mother was a teacher, but she was also a piano player, and stride piano was her expertise. That's a style of mainly Dixieland type style music and ragtime, where you play the root, and then with the left hand you hit the root, and then you come up and play a chord. So it's boom chink, boom chink, boom chink, and then the
Okay.
melody with the right hand. So she was um, very good at that. She wasn't exactly a virtuoso, but she was a very good entertainer, and people loved her. And then my older brothers, one was a drummer and one was a trumpet player and cornet, and then my sister played clarinet and sang. And then with another friend that was of their age group, all those are 9 years older than me, had a Dixieland band called the Northland Dixie Stompers in northern Michigan, and they were quite popular. So I grew up as long as I can remember, 3, 4, 5 years old, sitting on the piano bench at our home with jam sessions into the wee hours in the morning, going to sleep on the piano bench, hearing that music. So I was inspired by that, and I had from really early teens on, 13, 14, 15, only one desire, and that was to be a professional musician. And my parents would bring friends over. We had a lot of friends in that Traverse City area that were quite expert musicians, clarinetist, a trumpet player, a bass player, actually a drummer. They'd come over and we'd, for dinner, and we'd talk, and they all had careers other than music. One was had a printing shop, one had an insurance business, one had, all these different businesses. My parents' intention was to get me to have as an idea that I need to find something that I could fall back on
Right.
if I didn't make
Popular
it.
phrase.
Right. And so I, being the rebel that I was and probably still am to some degree, I said, "Listen, let me just tell you, if I have something to fall back on, like a teacher or whatever, and that's not any derision on a teacher at all, but if I had it to fall back on, I wouldn't try hard enough to make it as a musician." And I don't know if that's true, but it has worked for me.
Right.
And so I never did have something to fall back on. And sometimes I fell back on the good graces of my mother-in-law's, extra room or something like that, But most of the time I was able to get a position. I always had the theory, there's always a band out there that needs a bass player. I just have to find them,
Right. Yeah, bass players are a good bass player is really hard to find. I remember with my band, it was always a hard just trying to keep a bass player, and not any knock on bass players, but they were always a little odd. They always had like,
I
you
think
know,
that's true.
do you? I mean, I don't know where that came from, but it was just my personal experience of that. They were just kind of had a different way of looking at the whole piece and just seemed a little bit different. I don't know.
It's funny that you mention it that way because Kenny used to tell a story about the group that he was in early on called the Bobby Doyle Three.
Mhm.
He had prior to that he had not played bass. He'd only played guitar and sang. And he met up with Bobby, who was a blind piano player who was just terrific. I've met him several times, and a very great musician and singer. Really had a Ray Charles kind of approach, which was a big influence in Kenny's career, Ray Charles. And so Bobby asked him to join the group to play bass. And Kenny said, "Well, Bobby, I know you're blind, but I don't play bass. I play guitar." And he said that Bobby told him a sage advice. He said, "Well, Kenny, there's a lot more work for bad bass players than bad guitar players." And so that's where he started playing bass. And
Oh,
it was kind of funny. I didn't really think of this or realize this, but a road manager for Kenny early on, Garth Shaw, was a good friend, and he happened to mention this to someone in a post on Facebook one day. He said, Chuck was hired by Kenny to play bass in the group, and that's got to be a pretty good recommendation because Kenny was a bass player himself. So I thought, well,
yeah.
that's another way to look at it. I hadn't thought of it that way.
There you go.
Because when I
So,
joined the group, there was not a bass player
oh,
per se. One of the keyboard players, of which there were three, played bass on his left hand on a keyboard, and he was very good at that, and it really served them well. But at one point in '79, January '79, Kenny said he was going to be headlining at the Riviera Hotel in Vegas, and he said, we're going to have an orchestra behind us. I want to go in there with a bass player, and that's how the opening came up, and that's how I ended up joining the band.
wow. So early on, I was reading your bio, and you had you replaced Jocko.
Well, yes, and I always
That's
am
like blew me away.
right. I am always cognizant of that word replaced because
Well,
when you're
yeah, it's
talking
in the bio. That's why I used it.
right when you talk about a guy who has changed the world of electric bass
Yeah,
for all time, Jaco Pastorius, you can't say replaced. But what I did do was take over for him in a group called Wayne Cochran and the CC Riders.
right.
And that came about in 1972, and I had gone through a couple different bands, and I had heard that there through a friend, and how this is how most of jobs are gotten in the music world. For those that don't know, is it just it's a recommendation from this person to that person. Now nowadays there's more, especially in a big music town like Nashville, there's more auditions where they will have a cattle call, and there might be 20 bass players come in, and each of them are given 10-20 minutes to play, and then they you know get a job or get a call back. But mostly back in the early '70s, it was just a recommendation from somebody. You give them a call, and I heard that they were looking for a bass player, and so I called up and said, could I have a tryout? And they happened to be in Calumet City, Indiana, or Illinois, right down by Chicago. And as it happened, the hotel where they stayed was owned by their manager, who also owned a bowling alley and nightclub. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
seen many of those in the Northeast, but a nightclub contained within a bowling alley. And
Wow.
so Wayne would sometimes come there and play when they're not doing something else. And so I called him up and to see if I could maybe get an audition. So I came down and met Wayne that day in his hotel room. And Wayne Cochran, for those who don't know, was sort of billed as the white James Brown. He had a blonde hair, and it was in a pompadour kind of style, and he was really big on the fancy steps the way James Brown would do, and really did R&B, funk music. And he was really known for going into nightclubs and just turning it upside down, and the people would just go crazy nuts. They would love it. Usually had a large horn section, 9 to 14 people, and then a rhythm section to go with it. At the time that I worked with him, we had, I think it was 11 horns and 3 rhythm, guitar, bass, and drums. But anyway, I met with Wayne and had a nice conversation with him that afternoon. And he said, well, I've got right now the best bass player in the world. And I heard that and I said, well, now you got to realize I was 20 years old, I think, at that time, or just about 20. And I
Wow.
thought, I thought a lot of myself at that time, to be candid. And I said, well, I'll have to hear him if he's really the best player in the world, because I think I'm pretty good. Well, in order to get that job, you sort of had to have that ego.
Yeah.
And so he said, well, why don't you get together with the drummer and the sax player and go down to the club and play a little bit and let them see how you do. So I did. That afternoon, I got together with the drummer, Alan Robinson, great drummer, and the sax player, and they pulled out some charts. Well, my reading chops, meaning reading music notes, was not really all that great, but I did get along, and because I had a good ear, I could sort of fake it. If I didn't know it, I sort of get an idea what it was, and then make up a part that's similar to what was written. If you know what I
Right.
mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we played a number of songs, and I impressed them enough that they said, yeah, I think you're going to work. So I was playing with a jazz trio at that time, so I had to give him 2 weeks notice, and that worked for them because Jocko wanted to give them 2 weeks notice as well. And so then I went back to the hotel and hung out with Jocko that day and stayed over, and then went to see him play that night. And I said, yep, he is the best bass player in the world. And he
Wow.
was. He was quite
Yeah.
amazing. I got to know him a little bit in that next day or two,
Yeah.
and then I won't go into all the details, but I started 2 weeks later and had to sight read the show and got through it and playing songs that Jocko had written, for the band, and it was quite an experience. So I worked with him about 6 months,
Wow.
and then through the years, Jocko and I kept in touch. I don't know why, but we did. He would call me up. This is when I was working years later. After his weather report, well, during the weather report, but after, he had some troubled times, and he would call me up and just talk and stuff like that. And every once in a while, he'd just show up when we were playing the Kenny Rogers Band, and show up and hang out backstage and come see the show and just hang out, that type of thing. But in
Wow.
fact, one funny story, I'll try to make this quick, but a funny story. We were playing in Jacksonville, Florida, and I was in the hotel room, and we were going to play the arena there. And this would have been mid 80s, 85 maybe. And I had written a book called The Bottom Line on bass instruction, and I did interviews with top bass players all around the world. And one of those interviews that I did was with Jocko. And so it happened that I was sitting in my hotel room and knock, knock, knock on the door, opened it up, and there was Jocko. I said, wow, what are you doing here? He said, well, I was on my way to walking out to the airport. He didn't have a car. I'm walking out to the airport, and I looked up and I saw a sign that says Kenny Rogers tonight at whatever arena name that was. And he said, I'm going to go see my friend Chuck. And so sure enough, he turned around, came back there, and found out where the band was staying, what hotel, and came and knocked on my door. And he came to the show that night and hung out. And he didn't have any money, and I was able to give him a little money. And the other ironic thing about it was that he'd gone to the airport to pick up, at that time, mid 80s. None of the protocols that are in place now were in place then. Like just even simply it's the magnetometer check, going through, security check and stuff. That wasn't there. If you you didn't even have to hardly show your ID, but you did have to show your ID if you were picking up a ticket that someone else had bought for you, a pre-purchase ticket. Well, in this case, he had a pre-purchase ticket from someone that had wanted him to fly out to San Francisco to play on an album. And so he had gone to the airport and he had lost his wallet, his bag with his passport and his wallet. He had been, he said, on tour in Europe with Gil Evans. And he came back and somebody had stolen his bag and he didn't have his wallet or his passport or anything. So they
Jeez.
wouldn't give him his prepaid ticket because they couldn't. He said, I saw the sky caps there. I said, hey, you know who I am. Tell them who I am. And they did know who he was, but they still wouldn't give him a ticket. So
Wow.
as it happened, I had just received what's called a galley copy of my book, where the publisher sends you a pre-release version of it for you to look through. And so I had that with me. And on one page with the interview with Jocko, it had his picture and his name, for the interview. Well, believe it or not, I gave him that page and he used that as his ID the next morning to pick up his ticket to fly
Wow.
to San Francisco. It was just
Have times changed?
amazing story,
That is unbelievable. Now, I mean, as a bass player, Jocko was one of the just briefly because we've covered a lot about Jocko and stuff, but I'm fascinated by his story because besides the technical abilities that he had, why was he considered, other than the technical ability, what else was it about him that he's just so revered as like the greatest ever?
Well, what he did is he took I count Stanley Clarke as up there too as one of the biggest innovators of the electric bass, and
Yeah.
he was of a similar era. And I also did an interview with Stanley for that book, and he's a fantastic person as well. But Jocko had a couple things that changed bass forever. First of all, he took the frets out of his bass, so it was a fretless bass. Ironically enough, I had done that maybe a year prior to meeting him, so I also had the frets out of my bass. But that for him, and the way he played, really way back by the bridge, this plucking hand back by the bridge gave it. It's harder to play back there because it's more tension, but it gives you a much more percussive sound. That combined with the fretless aspect and the tone settings on his amplifier gave him a sound that was unique. Oh, and also in addition to that was round wound strings. Remember, this is early 70s.
Right.
Round wounds were used by Chris Squire, for instance, of Yes, not Yes, but yeah, I think it was Yes. Anyway, Chris Squire used round wounds, but he used a pick. He used a unique sound. Most bass players used flat wound strings at that time, which was a more muted sound. But that round wound string that Jocko used, which was roto sounds, gave it almost a piano kind of sound when he plucked it. So it was a very unique sound. And then that was to begin with.
Right.
Then secondly, his approach to playing bass was different than, I want to say anyone, but virtually anyone else. He didn't start out from saying, what's the role of a bass player to play just the low notes and this and that. He loved jazz, and he loved the instrumentals and the melody lines, that he would learn the melody lines from all the songs that he would learn. And so when he approached the bass part, it would come from that aspect, from that viewpoint. And that doesn't mean he played the melody all the time, but because he knew the melody and could express it, it came through in his bass parts that he would create. What was so unique about Jocko was that he would set the groove for the song to such a degree that now there's bass players that do it today that are do that too, but they followed his lead. But he set the groove so strongly that even when he went away from the groove still felt like it was still there. That was the unique thing, because he could play a solo kind of line, but you still knew where the groove was.
Yeah.
So that was different than any bass player had done prior to that. And to one degree or another, I think most bass players today are strongly influenced by that, whether they know it or not, to tell you the
Oh
truth.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I saw an instructional video that he did. I think probably one of the last
Yeah,
things he
probably the one
did.
with Jerry Jamont. Yeah.
Yeah, and he almost almost sometimes doesn't. It's difficult for him to explain what he's doing because he's at some other level, and I don't think he really understood what level he was in. Because I remember watching the documentary and or the instructional video and not really understanding what he was trying. The playing was incredible, but it seemed like the other guy that was there with him was more explaining and trying to kind of like pull out of him what it is that he was doing because he just seemed to be in another.
You're exactly
y-
right. And Jerry, of course, was renowned in the New York area. Memphis Soul Stew, and he played on a lot of the Aretha records. He was a really big R&B bass player, and had a great reputation himself. And that video, unfortunately, Jocko, that was one of his low points. I mean, you
Yeah,
can tell when you look at him. It's like the
yeah,
clothes he's wearing are probably been on his back for a week without a shower, you know. And and he wasn't out of it. He still was playing great, but
yeah,
you're right. He wasn't a he did some things at the Musicians Institute of Technology in L.A. too, where he would do a, you know, what do you call it?
web workshop or
Seminar or workshop, yeah, right,
seminar. Yeah,
or clinic, yeah. And but and sometimes he was better at explaining where he was coming from than others. I remember that video that you're speaking of very, very fondly, uh, my heart broke when I saw it because I could see that he was on his down and out basically. Um,
yeah,
and really, it wasn't too long after that. I mean, he really went downhill after that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
you're right; it was hard for him to express really the depth of understanding, and it was just that he did it. You know, he would just
yeah.
do it, and explaining it was another thing altogether.
Right, yeah, because it is two different things, really, when you think about it. It's the doingness and the actual explaining it are two completely separate things. How long after that experience did you actually meet up with Kenny?
Well, that period of time is the mid '80s, and uh, I, the the mid '80s is when I was already had been with Kenny for a while. So I started with Kenny in '79, and prior to '79, I from '76 or no wait '77, the end of '76, so '77 and '78, about almost 3 years. I lived in the New York area in Manhattan, and then out on Long Island, and I was with a jazz trio, the Roy Merriweather Trio, and a fantastic piano player, and we played all around New York, and then we would do college concerts around the nation, and I loved that group, and it was a big challenge uh, to me musically, and probably my chops, my capability on the instrument were at their zenith at that point, and it was always, there was only three of us, so even though he was the leader of the group, we still got quite a bit of accolades because there was only three of us,
Right.
and I loved it. And uh, but every time the Kenny Rogers group would come into our area, New York, to play at so for instance, the horse racing track there in New Jersey, I think it is, and or down at the in New Jersey, that Performing Arts Center outside. I can't remember the
Yep.
name of it now.
Yeah, PNC, I
I
think,
think it's
or
called the PNC now. Yeah.
yeah.
And whenever they'd play those different places, a friend of mine was already working with Kenny at that time. I had been in a group with him in the early '70s, and Edgar Struble, and he was playing keyboards and guitar and congas, and became pretty much the music director of the group. And I would go to visit with him, and then I mean, half a dozen times they would come to the area, and I got to know the guys in the group. And in fact, I would bring my bass once in a while, and we'd jam at sound checks, and got to know Kenny a little bit. And so when it was funny, in the end of '78, I was in New York, or no, in LA, playing at a jazz club there called the Hong Kong Bar. It was a pretty famous jazz club with the piano player. And my brother and I sat down and we did a little analysis of, well, where are you at, Chuck? What are you going to do? You know, that type of thing. And put down a thing called an admin scale. It's where you basically put down your goals and your purposes and what you're really want to do. You know, we did this. And as one of the just sort of throwaway items on this admin scale, we put down, well, you should strengthen the comm line with the Kenny Rogers band. Just put that down just for the heck of it, you know. And it wasn't like, and it's not like I thought, oh, I really want to work with the band, and oh, I got to really this and that. It wasn't that. It was just a throwaway item. And so I got back home to the apartment I was staying in North Hollywood, and I actually called up the drummer, who was sort of the leader of the group at the time. And I said, hey, Bobby, this is Chuck Jacobs. Oh, good to hear from you. What you doing, blah, blah, blah. And I said, you know, I don't know if I would really be interested or if I'd be the right guy, but if you guys decide to add a bass player, I'd like to throw my hat in the ring. That was all I said. I mean, that was it. That was the lightness of that action. And that was early December of '78. And so we finished the job at that Hong Kong bar, and I drove back to Michigan to be with my wife's family at Christmas time. And right after Christmas, right before New Year's Eve, I didn't have a job on New Year's Eve, and I got a phone call from that same guy, that drummer, Bobby. And he said, Chuck? I said, yeah. He said, well, Kenny wants to add a bass player, and we think you're the guy.
Oh my Lord!
Now this is 2 weeks later, you know, and so I'm kind of guessing that most people would have said, "Oh my God!" I bet you said yes right away. The irony is that, as I explained briefly before, I was loving playing this jazz trio.
Yeah.
And I said to him, "That sounds like something I might be interested in, but would you mind if I thought about it overnight?" You know, and he said, "No, I don't mind at all. That's fine." He said, "Let's just talk tomorrow." And as it happened, I sat down with my wife and we talked about the ways in our life, how our life would be affected, how it would be changed if I decided to do that job, and just sort of put down 2 columns. You know, what would happen if, you know, as far as individually, what would happen? Would I be happier or not as happy? You know, and I put down the scale of 1 to 10, you know, on each side.
Right.
And what about our marriage? How would it affect our marriage? You know, if we thought about having kids, although I love playing jazz, I'd never made more than $19,000 a year doing that, you know. So it's kind of hard to think about raising kids and that type of income, or having a house, maybe. What, all these different things. So we put it down, and at the end of the day, the next day, I said, I think that I should, if it's still available, I should probably try to do this. So I called, and we basically made the arrangements, and that's how I ended up starting with the band. I never even had an audition, you know.
Wow.
It just came about, and then the first gig was, I think 2 weeks later, because I had to give 2 weeks notice to the jazz guy I was playing with. And here's an irony: the same guy, that jazz group, that's the same guy I'd been working with before I went and did the Wayne Cochran gig to take Jocko's place. And now here, later, 6 years later, maybe 5 years later, whatever it was, or maybe 6 years. Anyway, I was working with him again before I went with Kenny. Isn't that a funny irony? I just thought of that.
That's unbelievable.
And so then the first gig was in Las Vegas. I flew out to Las Vegas, and they had sent me a tape to learn the songs, and I learned all the songs. And the first day for rehearsal, I thought, well, they're going to, let me go through all the songs. And they didn't concentrate on me at all, because it was their first day with the orchestra, and the arranger that did all the arrangements had to run all the songs through to make sure the arrangements were right. And I was sort of a, second thought,
Right.
but we went through most all the songs. And at the end of the, during the rehearsal, Kenny didn't go to many rehearsals, but he did come to that one. And he paid a compliment right off the bat. He said, I really like the sound of your bass, Chuck. That's nice. Well, that's a nice thing to hear from a bass player, number one. And number two, it's I kind of lucked out to replace a person who was playing bass on keyboard. When you're playing it as the instrument, you kind of, you get a little leg up there, because it's just, you're only thinking of one thing, instead of the keyboard part and the bass part. So we did the show that night. One of the songs that we did not run through was Lucille, because it didn't really have any orchestra part on it. And on the recording I had, the first thing I heard in my ear, I didn't hear a click count off. I mean, all the other songs had drum sticks clicking to 1, 2, 3, 4. Didn't hear any count off. The first thing that appeared in my ears when I heard it on the tape was the bass playing boom, boom, boom. All right, so the very first note was the bass note, and actually it was the bass drum also, but it was just boom, and then the guitars were chink, chink, boom, chink, boom, chink, chink, boom, like that. So I didn't hear any count off. So if you don't hear a count off, and your first thing you hear is the bass, you kind of assume, at least I did, that you were the one that was going to start the song, right? So here we go. At the end of the show, Lucille's the next song. I look to my left, I look to my right, look around. Nobody's looking at me like I'm going to start the song, right? But I figured, well, I guess I'm supposed to just start it. So I just started. And everybody sort of jumped and started playing in with it, and everything went fine. And after the show, the guy said, what were you doing? Why did you start? Well, I explained that's how I heard it on the tape. Well, normally what we do is the drummer would do what we call an air count. He would, with his stick, it would go 1, 2, 3, like that.
Right.
Then everybody would come in. He didn't click them together. I just took the bull by the horns,
shocked everyone up
and went with it. It was funny. It was genuinely funny.
Oh man! So you must have had a lot of amazing experiences like that. When you were with Kenny during those years, and all the other performers, the performances, and was there any time that you ever got starstruck? Like somebody came in and you're like, oh, besides Kenny himself.
It's funny. The quick answer is no. I did really enjoy meeting some really big people. Bob Hope I met, wow. Frank Sinatra I met in the restaurant in Riviera after hours, and do a lot of big people. We were in Australia, and we were in this hotel, and they called it the Rock and Roll. What did they call it? The Rock and Roll Hilton. It wasn't a Hilton, but it was a hotel. And all the rock acts stayed there. One time we were staying there in 84 it was. And Elton John was staying there. Melissa Manchester was staying there. And Police was staying there. Was staying in Andy, can't remember their names now, the guitar player and the drums. And it was amazing, because that was the time I was working on my book, and I was doing interviews, and I thought, oh, it'd be neat if Sting would do an interview. And I happened to be up, the pool was on the upper floor, on the top floor, and my wife and I were up there swimming and sunning ourselves, and Sting was up there getting some sun as well. So I took the moment to just ask him. I said, I'm doing this book. Would you be willing or interested in doing an interview, and he declined. But he was nice about it. It was
Mm.
kind of interesting. But the story about that was funny is that Kenny was on top of the heap at that time, 84.
Yeah.
And we did the arena. There was an arena there in Sydney called the Entertainment Center, held 18,000 people, and and we had 8 shows. So it was over 6 nights. We did 6 nights. 2 of those nights we did matinees,
Oh
and
man.
sold out the full 8 nights. It was huge. In fact, one of the shows they did a live remote from LA for the People's Choice Awards, where they gave Kenya a People's Choice Awards. But what was interesting is you looked out the window at the hotel, and there was always a throng of young ladies there outside looking for the guys in police, mainly Sting,
Yeah.
because they were working while we were doing those 8 shows. They did one show at the soccer pitch, the soccer grounds,
Mhm.
for 56,000 people.
Jeez.
It was just amazing. And that was 84, and that was our first trip to down under, to Australia and New Zealand. And we ended up doing that trip 8 times through the 40 years. And it was probably, I mean, we travel all over the world. I mean, but Australia and New Zealand probably our favorite. I think our favorite places to have traveled and the experience. We a lot of times would have promoters that would schedule days off so we could do other things to see some of the sites there were there. Like one of the last times we were there, we went to a SeaWorld and swam with the sharks. So
Oh
and
my lord.
then another time we did a trip to a place called Catherine's Gorge that was sort of like their Grand Canyon, as it were.
Mm.
I mean, it was still as magnificent as Grand Canyon, but it had a river that ran through these rock formations and stuff, and we were able to go on that. It was interesting. We took a boat ride down the river, which was fantastic, and then afterwards, they scheduled us to be able to go on a helicopter ride over that same river. That was
Oh wow.
just blew us away. It was an incredible day.
Boy.
And but in '83, I think it was, we played in South Africa at the casino that was over there. That was a unique experience. Played there in South Africa a couple, 2 or 3 times. In 2015, the last time, and then all the Far East, Singapore and Thailand and all those places. That was totally unique too, and it was. I mean, I think back on it and think of the experiences. It wasn't just one tour. I have a good friend that I played with years and years ago who was with Michael Jackson in the touring period where when Bad was out, and he was a featured guitarist on the band, and it was fantastic. And he still is fantastic. Um, but he didn't do it for a long time, And I'm not saying that's bad or good. It's just that having done this for as long as we did, to be able to see all the different places more than
Yeah.
once, it was a gas,
Yeah.
We went to, like I said, we went to Australia, New Zealand 8 times. We also went to England, Ireland, Scotland, probably as many, and got to know a lot of friends there, and and just unique. I loved the old world, because my heritage comes from that area. So it's and
Mhm.
my wife happens, I don't know why, but she loved that historical era, and so she knew all about it. She was telling me about it when we would go to that area, and
Yeah.
that was fascinating.
That's so great. I'm gonna actually flash up a couple of photos and see if they. I took them from your website. Obviously, this is. We
Oh yeah,
see this.
that's the one on the top, of course, is Islands in the Stream,
Yeah.
and that was when we were playing in what we called the pit, because we had an octagon stage where Kenny, in this case Kenny and Dolly, would walk around, and then we
Right.
were on the floor, what would be lower, and
Yeah.
that's why I'm so much lower there,
Yeah. I
and
didn't think you were on your knees or anything, 'cause that'd be weird.
that was mid '80s, I think. That might have been the Real Love video. Now that I think about it,
Yeah, I think it's real. The real love video. Yeah,
yeah.
but
Oh, that
it's
says
around
it
that
there, doesn't it?
same
Yeah,
era, I believe, around that same time.
yeah. And Then the one on the bottom is from the 50 years show, where a bunch of big stars, Smokey Robinson being one of them, came together to honor Kenny and do songs of his while he sat in the audience and watched them. So that
Right.
was the song "Morning Desire," which is this fantastic song, and Smokey just did a wonderful rendition of it. A
Yeah.
funny story about Smokey, real quick. I know we're sort of running out of time, but it,
No, we're good. We're good.
is that he was asked to sing "It's Crazy," and it was a song that Kenny had.
Mhm.
And when the music director on that was, it's ironic, a music director outside of our band came in to be the music director for the show. Anyway, he told Smokey's people that they wanted us to do "Morning Desire" and "Crazy." Well, if you heard someone ask you to sing the song "Crazy," you very well may think of the song recorded by Patsy Cline,
Patsy Cline, right?
right? Am
Yeah.
I right?
Yes.
Well, so in the afternoon rehearsal, Smokey walked over by the keyboard player Gene Sisk over by me and say, "Hey, can you play that Crazy a little bit so I can, just sort of get my bearings on it?" And so he started playing it, and Smokey said, "What song is that?" And it was "It's Crazy" by Kenny,
Yeah.
and you know,
That was
it's not the Patsy Cline "Crazy,"
right.
right?
That was
So
written by Lionel Richie, I believe, right? I think it was also written by Lionel Richie, was it?
I'm not sure if that one was written by Lionel, but anyway,
That's
it
so
was a Kenny
funny.
Rogers hit. Now, this tells you how professional Smokey was. First of all, he didn't get upset. He didn't get mad. He just said, "Well, can you get me a recording of that so I can study it?" And he went to his hotel room and he studied the song and learned it. And so when we did the show, he did the two songs, "Morning Desire" and "Crazy." It's Crazy,
Wow.
and did it with no problem. He was just so pro, just an absolute top of the heap. That
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
one of the big thrills for me to play behind him, especially the "Morning Desire," because the bass part is a big feature on that particular song.
Yeah.
There's another on my website. When you click on Smokey Robinson, there's another song that we did was a hit for Smokey, and he came. We did a show at Kenny's farm called the Classic Weekend. It was a unique show that they did, combining sports with entertainment. They would bring together four um, celebrities. They would bring together like a music or entertainment celebrity, like an
Mhm.
actor or a musician, and then like a golfer, maybe a basketball player, and a football player sometimes. So it would be four different diverse fields, and they would then form teams. They would have four teams, so they have 16 altogether, and then they would compete. They would have a basketball game, and they would have a fishing thing, and then they would have um, uh, a golfing thing, and so it was really unique. And then they would have a concert at the end of this 2 days, and so Smokey was there and did a song that he was had popular, just to see her. I think just to
Yeah.
see her. I think is the name of it. And it's just a great song. And he brought his keyboardist who played the heck out of the keyboard. And it was just really a lot of fun. I loved meeting him, and he was just like I said, a consummate professional.
Yeah, that's what I've heard other people say the same thing. Like he's just always been right on point, very professional, comes in, does his thing. And he's also very in present time of what's happening in the room, which is always cool to see. I got one more photo here that I want to just flash up here real quick.
Oh yeah, this was a in preparation of a rehearsals for a Christmas show in I think it was '94 or yeah around let me think. I think it was 94, and it was, I can't remember the name of the Christmas show right now, but uh, Kenny asked Garth if he would come and sing on the show, and I think it was pretty early in Garth and Trisha's relationship, and she came too and sang. So it was a real thrill to have both of them sing on the show.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the Garth is that in 1989 and 90, early in 90, Garth opened up for Kenny on quite a number of dates.
Mm.
And so we saw him, you know, before he was big at all. And that, to be truthful, that happened with a lot of artists. The Judds were similar to that.
Yeah.
And other artists that opened up for Kenny became really big artists later on. But Garth, I remember sitting with the bass player, and he was also the road manager for Garth at that time. I don't remember his name, but I remember sitting backstage one time with him, and he said, "You know, this guy Garth is going to be huge. I really see him being as big as Kenny Rogers." And at the time, I said to myself, "Yeah, sure." And now Garth had a magic about him. Don't get me wrong,
No,
but
yeah.
I couldn't. This was in the, like I say, in 1990, I think. And uh, and the next year, Garth did a marketing campaign. He was smart marketing wise.
Yeah.
He went to every venue that Kenny was playing, and booked either before or right after the date that Kenny was going to be there, and went in and played for 20% less for the ticket price to to get the audience, because he
Yeah.
had made the connection with the audience from touring with Kenny, and so then coming in to play as his being as the main artist and doing it for a little less money, it was a smart business decision, and it really
Yeah.
launched his career. It really
That's
did.
amazing. That's amazing that I guess his people probably sat down and they decided to go, what's the greatest good to try to get the
Right,
most audience, you know. So
right, right.
that's a
He's
good move.
he's always been very nice to us. In fact, he had already been in the Country Music Hall of Fame when Kenny was brought in 2013, and he was the one that inducted Kenny with a
Oh,
speech. They always have one artist would induct you as a,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, with a speech, and he was the one that did that, and it was very nice. And he's always been nice to us, and I know he treated his band well as too. I've got a couple friends that work with him, and he treats them real nice. And in fact, the guy that had been with us early on as a crew member, and who does rigging, that's where the guys would go up in the top of an arena and
Oh,
hang
yeah.
the chains that hold up the rig. And he Garth hired Lanny Landers away from Kenny uh, to go with him on his tour.
Garth.
But that was actually, it was okay because we weren't
Yeah.
doing as many of the things that required Lanny's expertise on that.
Mm. So one question on is this book still in circulation? Is it still, can
Well,
we?
not really. It is out of print.
Okay.
I think when I get the other book out, I think I might redo this book and maybe do a couple newer interviews. And
Yeah.
what's interesting about that book is I did that in the mid '80s. Um, it's not as much of a how-to book as a why you play
Right.
bass.
Right. I read a little bit and I was it was interesting take on it because I think that does actually give a perspective of what the instrument is and why you're actually even picking it up in the first place.
Yeah, the
And
role of a bass player in a group, you know.
yeah, yeah. So
And
that's a
bass is actually quite an easy instrument to play. I mean, you can pick it up. It's got four strings, and you can thump along and really make it work. It's I always say it's an easy instrument to learn to play, a hard instrument to master, because it's the nuance of bass is what I have always been in love with, is that And some of my friends wouldn't say that I'm too nuanced a person, but I kind of think musically that I am. I sit in the background and provide what's needed, and for the song, Leland Sklar is a friend, and he's
Mhm.
always said he's famous bass player for those who don't know,
Oh
uh,
yeah,
and played on maybe 5,000 different records.
yeah. No,
Um,
I saw him on tour with I think it was Phil
with
Collins.
Phil Collins, yeah.
Yeah,
And he also did the Toto tour too. But
yes.
he had a phrase that I thought was always really appropriate. I did an interview with him in the book as well, um, and he said, I don't try to play the song. I let the song play me." Basically, he listens to the song and plays as little as possible to make it work, and
Right.
that way you let other people have places to play.
Yeah.
And it certainly works. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, he's been doing these great during the quarantine. He's been doing these. I don't know if you've seen them, but he's been doing these videos from his home
I
where
have
he
seen
kind
them.
of breaks down some of the songs, and some of these songs, like Studio by Phil Collins,
That was
very,
amazing.
very,
That's amazing,
very
isn't it?
amazing bass on that. Just incredible bass player. Um, Chuck, I want to thank you so much for your time. I feel like we can just go on and on, but it's going over an hour, and I don't want to impose too much. But your stories, I think, probably are in your book coming up, are just going to be incredible, especially having so much documentation with the photos. Can you tell us a little bit more about the inspiration of the book, and then we'll wrap up?
Yeah, it's funny. First, I'd like to just touch on the fact that you start these interviews out, and I think, what am I going to talk about? And then before you know it, an hour has gone by.
I know I hear it a lot. People,
And
yeah,
I've just been blabbing, blabbing, blabbing. But
love it.
we were in Australia and we did a master class down there. And the promoter wanted to do something for the city, and the two guitarist players and we didn't have anything planned out. And before you know it, 2 hours were gone, and we was like, oh my god. Um, but regarding the book, what I'm hoping to do is to have a chronological history, and the continuity between just the going through the decades and what we did during those times. A lot of really exciting times were in the 80s when Kenny was really on top, and it was I mean, he could do nothing wrong. I mean, you would put an album out and it would go platinum. It would ship platinum, And I remember we did the album Gideon, and
Oh
the
man,
band played on that one on all the songs. It was some gas. We loved it, and it sold 4 million copies, and they thought that was a flop. It was amazing because prior to that, the Gambler had done something like 15 million records.
right.
But so going through the all the different decades and the experiences, I hope that I can, I'm going to try to do it in a conversational style, similar to what we've done here, and I'm have an editor that's going to work with me to hopefully make it so the continuity is smooth and make it interesting to read. Um, but I think just telling the story should be interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, here we are an hour into this, a little over an hour, and I've just scratched the surface of
Right.
stories to be told. It's quite
Yeah.
amazing.
It is
But
amazing. And
I appreciate the time, and I really appreciate your willingness to listen. That's
oh gosh.
a big quality in an interviewer, I tell you.
Oh well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. I mean, it's my honor. Like I said earlier on a thing I recorded, that Kenny Rogers and your music with Kenny was such a big part of growing up for me. I mean, when Islands in the Stream came out, my mom would literally put the record on and just let the needle come back, and it'd be playing for like 9 hours, 10 hours a day. She just loved the record, and me, my brother, my sisters are all Kenny Rogers huge fans. So it is an honor really to talk to you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your stories in the book. And if you need anything, like when you're ready to launch, I would love for you to come back, or even before that, and maybe scratch a little bit more of the surface, and go into some other stories, because I could probably hear them all night. So I really appreciate you so much.
Well, I thank you so much. And thank you for everybody who had a chance to listen in. And I don't know if you recorded this
Oh yeah.
for previous or for future listenings, but
Yeah,
that
this will be on YouTube. This will be on YouTube, on my Facebook page. It's on a couple of other places. So you'll definitely, I'll send you a copy also, so you can have it, and I'll share it all over the place. So
terrific. Well, I
yeah,
appreciate it. Have a good night.
thank you so much. Have a good night.
All right. Bye
Take
bye.
care. All right, folks. Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much to Chuck Jacobs for taking the time to come here. I'm like blown away. I do feel like the hour went boom. It was so fast. Like, definitely just scratch the surface on a career like that. So I will definitely work with Chuck and see if you want to come back in the future and do some more of this, because I think this was a lot of fun. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. If you like these interviews, please subscribe to my channel, my YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe, hit the like button, and then hit the little bell to remind you. And thank you so much. I'll see you all tomorrow night at 9:30 again. Take care and peace.